Thank you, everyone, for being here. Well, it's a quite ambitious title that I have here. And I will try to convince at least part of you that we actually managed to do something that we usually use in software development easier to read for someone who is not involved in software development, right? Because if something we've learned in software engineering in recent years, and we usually learn it the hard way, is that we need to get people involved. So we've probably learned two things, that software products have a better result, whatever the result is, but we are better off if people are involved in the whole development process, people that are going to use it, or people who are going to pay for them, for the products. That is something that we, as I said, learned the hard way. And we've also learned, and most of the times also the hard way, that we need to test the products, right? And probably one of the biggest exponents of these two recommendations or lessons learned is the whole set of recommendations that the Agile community is making. So one of the, or two of the claims that the whole Agile philosophy is trying to push, and is successfully pushing into the software development industry, is these two components. So if you want to succeed more, involve your stakeholders and test as soon as possible. And those are actually the two, these 2 points that I want to start off from. And involving the stakeholders usually means finding ways of communicating what we have in our minds, or the way we talk to each other when we are in a technical level, to another level of abstraction. And that has materialized in ways of showing things in a graphical way with, say, UML-like and graphical languages, and ways of writing things that are not completely free, so it's not just natural language, but it will try to force people to speak in a certain manner so that we then can process that easier. And that will, an example of that would be user stories, for instance. So that's one of the things. So if you want to involve people, you should try to be inclusive in the way you model and you communicate things. And then if you want to test, or you want to test more, you probably want to start off by eliminating any possibility that you won't test something. And the best exponent, or the best representative of that philosophy is the test-driven development methodology, right? That it will actually claim that you should write the test before anything else, or before the actual code that will end up passing that test, hopefully. And the thing is that combining these two, we've seen the birth of what they call behavior-driven development, that will use slight variation of user stories that are immediately translated into tests. And that's the way that you lead your whole development process. For those of you who have never seen something like that, the actual product with which we work when we use behavior-driven development, but we could say that the biggest exponent, or the most well-known tool within this setup or setting is Cucumber, which comes from the Ruby community, and actually tries to capture the requirements in this kind of language that you see here. So we will describe features, and features are sets of scenarios related to a feature or functionality that we want to add to a product. And we will force people to say what the purpose is. So that's the in order to. So we want to have a purpose for everything that we do. We want to identify who is that interesting for. And then we want to say what we want to do. And then we will give examples of how that feature is materialized in the software itself. So in this case, the feature, or the set of features that we come later on, will be for dealing with lists of elements, and then we below have an example of how we will use, for instance, the deletion feature of software that deals with lists of integers, say, right? So that's what the stakeholder will see. And I guess we can agree that this is something that someone with no technical background could understand. Then, of course, the developers go and have to extract the tests out of this. And well, there are a number of Cucumber clones in a number of languages, and this code is from the Cucumber clone for Erlang. But it means that you will have a library that will help you somehow to parse these files because they have to have this structure. But then you, as a developer, have to manually do the work of, well, when I get this piece of text, then what it means for my testing is, well, I want to, to say, take this piece, and this is a call to a function in a module that I have implemented, and that's my actual test, right? So, well, this is, well, I will get to that in a moment. So that's the thing, and well, if we want to assess how successful is this idea, how is this growing, is it creating some interest? But I guess the answer is, well, probably yes. I mean, if we look at the trend of search and Google Trends, so people are interested in knowing what Cucumber in the software category is and how it works, it's steadily growing. And something happened at the end of 2005. Don't ask me what exactly, but there was this spike there. And then, so that you can have a little context, we can compare this to what the trend is for something more well-established, so to say, that is JUnit, that well, a lot of people use. Well, you see that it's probably stable by now, but it's not growing at the well, in contrast with Cucumber. So, well, that's what the behavior-driven development people advocate for, and I agree with them that this is good for communicating with the stakeholders. But I don't agree that is the way that we want to go as far as testing is concerned. If you were in John's talk about the testing Dropbox, well, I hope you came out of that talk with the idea that writing unit tests is not what you want to do. You want to write a model and then use that model to write tests, and then testing gets more meaningful. So what I want to talk about here today is how we can, well, I will make a brief pass on property-based testing for those of you who weren't in that talk or who haven't heard about this kind of testing that I'm talking about, in which you write something else that is not a specific unit test case. And the whole philosophy behind property-based testing, or model-based testing also as a, well, sister theory, if you will, is that we abstract, again, same as we did with the communication tools for stakeholders. We abstract the level. So we don't want to have specific test cases. We want to have something that describes the behavior in a more generic way, and then have some tooling that helps us to translate that into specific test cases. And in that, we have those two powerful factors combined, abstraction and automation, right? And actually, there's also a hint here for those of you, again, who were in John's talk. He didn't show any code there, right? And even though he's at a conference in which forgive me if I assume that we all could read a few lines of functional language code. And still, he showed you a few slides describing what the different operations of the Dropbox service was supposed to do, and the preconditions and the postconditions, but he wasn't showing you code. So what I'm getting at is that property-based testing and the family of tools are very powerful for testing. And to give you an idea of how, again, from the developer point of view will look like, well, say that we have exactly the same thing that we were trying to communicate with Cucumber before. I don't want to write that specific case that was in the Cucumber slide. I want to have something more general. So I want to say, OK, I'm going to delete elements from lists. I don't want to specify the elements. I don't want to specify the list. Just you take them. Someone make them for me. I just want lots of them and gain the confidence that this is well implemented. Well, again, in the in the Erlang quick check in the Erlang version of quick check, you will write something like this or a slight variation. What I want you to focus here is in the use of these universal quantifiers, ways of saying I'm going to create lots of values of I and lots of values of L using these functions that we call generators, and those are the ones that is actually interesting to implement. And then I want to do something with them, and that's, in the end, it's a Boolean sentence that has to either pass or not and show me, if not, the values that challenge this sentence here. And again, here I'm assuming that there is such a function in which I trust, of course, because I'm going to use it for testing purposes. But otherwise, I could write it in any other, the Oracle in any other way that I could feel confident on. And I wrap this around a function, and then I call that function with the tooling support, and I get the cases generated. And if I get a counterexample, as John was showing, I get this shrinking, which is very nice from the developer point of view. And of course, this is a simple example, but for more complex examples, and here I have a very, it's not super complex, but it shows the need for a model. So in the Erlang virtual machine, you have a few functions for registering, unregistering, and looking for the process identifier of process if you've given it a name, right? And of course, when I'm testing this, I don't want to test one after the other in isolation. I want to test the whole system, performing sequences of calls to register and unregister queries with different names, different bits, and so on. So what I write here is not something like we've seen before, but well, I will get back to that. I write what was behind the idea of those slides that John was showing with the precondition and postcondition. So I actually write those callbacks. So for instance, for the register operation, I would say, okay, I don't want to call this function unless I've created some process already, and this is the internal state of my test model. And then, for instance, for the ARM register, I will say, well, after the ARM register, I want to save the name that I've used to, well, I want to delete the name that I've just unregistered from the place in my test state that I keep the names that have been used before. And for instance, as the post condition of the queries, I want to check if the result that I get from the system is actually what I expect. And then for that, again, I use the information that I save in my model to try and find if this result is what I would expect. So that's, I mean, you write that in this case, as an Erlang module that is run. And the general property here is that, well, we have this model, and assume that we've written it in this module. We will generate sequences of calls to the functions defined in that module. And then what I want to is just to check that after running those, no preconditions or no postconditions are violated. So the philosophy is the same. It's only that it gets a bit more complicated how you write these things. So again, we have like the symmetric situation that with Cucumber. This is great for testing, and I will not try to convince you of that later in the coffee break if you're not convinced yet. But I guess we can agree that it's not good for communicating this with other people. I mean, not even John showed you the code for the state machine in his talk. So there's probably no little use, let's say, in showing this to a client and say, no, you should be confident that I've tested this very good because here's my model. Okay, I cannot read that model, right? So what we did in a research project called Prowess, which is funded by the EU and joined a few universities and industries around Europe, well, one of the results of that project was a small attempt to see if we could come up with a way of communicating these models. Because we were trying to promote the adoption of this kind of testing, but we need to fill that gap. And the proposal was, well, there are some attempts, and we've seen them in behavior-driven development, of using semi-natural language to communicate these things. And they seem to be working, and people seem to find them useful. So can we come up with something similar for property-based testing, for the artifacts that we write when we use property-based testing, for properties, for models? And so we did, and we called it ReadSpec, and you can try that. There are some examples. There's also the ones that I've shown here and a few others also. And just to show you the results, not the inner part, because you can check the code on the GitHub or ask me later on. What someone will get by using ReadSpec, having a property file or having a model file, will be something like this. So you will run the tool against your property, and you will have examples that come up from your property, or example of sequences that come up from your model, translated in the case of the property to that same structure that people are already used to if they're using behavior-driven development and Cucumber. Okay, so that's for properties. And then, of course, when we have that, we have the same for counterexamples, which is also nice to be able to show a counterexample to a non-technical person saying, OK, this is exactly what's going on, or this is what's taking me, I don't know, 2 weeks to fix, if you will. Then with the stateful models, we had a different approach because there was nothing like that before. Cucumber existed, but it described unit testing scenarios. And the kind of testing scenarios that we describe with the model are much more complex. So I can refer to you where you can actually read the whole technical report, or if you don't want to wait 1 year for the paper to come out. But we define what we consider was a compromise between the verbosity and the effectiveness of semi-natural language to express what a stateful model needs to express. So for each call or for each functionality that you take into account into the model, this is, for instance, the precondition for that, the one that we saw in code before. Of course, in code it's 2 lines, but for those who cannot read those 2 lines, well, here we describe which are the possibilities, meaning under which constraints this will result into evaluation false or evaluation true. And well, I won't get into too much detail on how that is done, but you can ask me later, or how these literals can be fine-tuned in order to better fit the language of a specific business area or so. So as a final claim in this presentation, well, to reassure ourselves and also to see if what we proposed was actually something that could be used in a real setting, so to say. We had in Prowess, we had a number of pilot studies around the same software system that was provided by one of our companies working in the project. And this is a video-on-demand streaming system with different parts built in different languages. And there were parts of this system that were not tested with property testing. And in the project, they were adapting and adopting this methodology. And in others that they had already started writing their own properties and their own models, we got those, we used those to check our own ReadSpec tool. And we wanted to find out 2 things, whether actually it was more a concern in the case of the stateful models, if the text that we're going to generate, if the model was too complex, was really efficient, if it was understandable, if it was something that people will actually use, and if it will actually communicate what was important for the testing of that component or system in this case. What we actually measured to try and answer those 2 questions was, well, the time that took to generate the textual representation, the length in lines of code, and we asked stakeholders explicitly to rate if they found it useful in the sense that would they use that representation instead of whichever other means of communicating the requirements or whatever was going to be tested at that moment. And also to rate the usability. I mean, if they found that it could be improved in some way, or if it was just easy to understand as it was, or whichever. I mean, it was a rating, and then in case the rating was bad, they had room to suggest improvements. And actually, some of the improvements were incorporated. And very quickly, the results is like, well, we only had one specific case of a very complex model that took a bit too long because it had a number of dependencies and a number of includes and imports. So we underestimated how long it took to actually go and resolve all the macros. So well, but it took, in that case, not even a minute. So it was, of course, long because it took a while. But in the rest of the cases, the conversion is something really, really quick. And the length was deemed appropriate by all stakeholders. And by stakeholders in this case, in the case of VocaTV, I mean, we involved almost everyone in the company. It's a small company, but we had both developers and people who are not technical. And in the group of developers, we had people that were fluent in functional languages and people that considered themselves not to be fluent in functional languages. And so there was consensus about the appropriateness of the length and the nature of the text output. And then for the simple cases, and in this I mostly mean the properties, we saw that there was, I mean, it was very dependent on the background of the person. If they thought that the code was easier to read than I mean the developers in this case. So developers who were fluent in functional language, they would say, no, I'd rather read the 2 lines of code that I showed you before. That was to be expected. But the rest, they said, OK, no, of course I prefer the text. For the complex cases, and for this I mean, with this I mean the stateful models, we also find like 2 cases, and it would be the case of people that no matter what, they found like the test, it was OK. It was maybe not 60 pages long, but it's, I don't know, let's say 10 pages long, the test that describes a really complex state machine. And I can read the English, but I don't really understand it all. I mean, it's still difficult for me. And then the other profile of person, that will be all the developers and some of the non-technical people, they will say that definitely they could understand it if they read the text and not always if they read the source code. And even if there were some cases actually during this whole pilot that they were able actually to propose new testing scenarios that were not being tested at that moment by reading the textual representation that ReSpec was generating. So we were pretty satisfied with that result. And I think that's all for my part. I will leave you there with some quotes of the interviews that we conducted. That, well, they reflect actually what I was trying to convey in the previous slides. And I think that's all for my part, and I'm happy to take your questions.
When you say stakeholders, what do you mean about? What do you mean? Is it people from business that have no clue what is coding, or this is something like product owners?
OK, so the question is, what do we exactly mean by a stakeholder? And we actually mean both the things you said. It could be the business person that is paying for the product and has no technical background whatsoever. It could be the user that it may not be the same person that pays for it, but it's going to be using it. And it can also be, if you're speaking in terms of Agile, the product owner, yeah. We don't make any distinction in that sense. So everyone involved in the process of developing a software project is considered a stakeholder. And we actually, in the pilot, we had every profile in that sense. As I said, taking advantage of the company behind VocaTV being a small company, we involved people from the accounting department and people from marketing and people from the development department. So.
And just to be sure, so this specification work also from people from business. They understand what does it mean.
Yes. So the question was to make sure that this includes business people, and yes, the answer is yes.
Yes, I see quite a lot of this enterprise development where we use this PDD also. And the problem is that if you have this kind of like product owners or system analysts, they start to think of the system as single unit test and not the whole structure, that what should the system do. And in this sense, this can be quite helpful. But also I would like to see some more general, like Cucumber, that would, like, for example, compile to the type definitions even, something like that. So just to give them some tool to think more abstract ways than just single test cases.
Well, I don't think that's a question, but I will rephrase the comment. So it's acknowledged that it's interesting, this kind of way of communicating technical stuff well, to other people. And what this person would like to is to see something like Cucumber, but a tool that people at the business level could actually use to play with these requirements or other kind of information about the technical information of the software development, more than just unit tests, so that you can see the whole product as a whole.
One more question.
So, as you point out, if somebody knows a little bit of programming, it's going to be much easier to read the actual formal text. So there's sort of two approaches, right? You could put a lot of work into translating the formal text into informal text, or maybe you could train the people that need to read the informal text how to read the formal text. I've wondered if you looked at those two things and what the trade-off is.
No. So the question is that, yeah, of course, well, as the pilots show, there were cases in which people will say, no, I'd rather read the actual code because it's simple enough. So the question is if we looked at the trade-off of teaching people how to read code rather than just focusing on translating code into other ways of reading it. And we didn't. We actually didn't do that. I think that both approaches are complementary, because there will be cases in that even though if you prove that you could teach all your marketing department in a week to read certain tests, there will be other constraints like inherent to the whole company or processor that they will prevent you from actually devoting that time. So for those cases in which you probably couldn't afford that, then having the alternative, which is, well, having the technical information conveyed in another way, it will help you fill that void. Otherwise, you're left with or, so.
Yeah, well, that's fair enough. I have to say my reaction to all of this is I wonder how far I can get with training, and to seeing an exploration of that trade-off I think would be useful. Seeing documentation about the places where it cannot work, which you're saying there are some, and I'm willing to believe. But seeing that explained, again, I think would be useful.
Yeah, just to rephrase the comment, so it would be actually useful to have this kind of study in which the trade-off between one approach and the other is compared, and I totally agree.
Thank you.
Thank you.